Hello, everyone. We're going to start the second part of this course. In the first part, we introduced the database structure. In the second part, we're going to look at the operation of the database and how do you manipulate data, retrieve data, modify data. So this is the part we call it SQL. SQL, pronounced SQL or SQL, is the language for accessing and managing database. Using SQL proficiently is essential for a database programmer. This part introduces fundamentals of SQL, advanced features of SQL, creating database objects, and how to use SQL manage transactions, control concurrency, and maintain security. So let's look at now chapter 4, basic SQL. So we're going to introduce SQL basics, and you're going to know the history of SQL, to create, modify, and drop tables, to become familiar with SQL data types, varchar 2, varchar, number, and date, to be able to define constraints and know the differences between named constraints and unnamed constraints. To know how to obtain table information and display constraints. To know how to display and enter date values. To learn to use simple SQL statements for queries and update operations. To become familiar with aggregate functions, count, min, max, average, and sum. To become familiar with Oracle number functions, character functions, date function, and conversion functions. Now, this is the number functions. We are going to use MySQL. It's very similar. So this should be the same as MySQL functions. To know how to use the operators like, between, and is full. To know how to use the order by clause, group by clause, and having clause. Now, let's look at the SQL. In the preceding chapter, you learned how to analyze data, and the relationship among data using the ER models. How to convert ER models into relation schemas, and how to further improve database design through normalization. Now, you are ready to create a database and manipulate data in the database using SQL. This chapter and next two chapters introduce SQL. So let's first look at the history of SQL. SQL is an acronym for structured query language. It's pronounced SQL or SQL. SQL has its roots in System R. System R is an experimental database system developed by IBM in early 80s. The language used in System R was called SQL, on which the SQL language was based. There are three versions of SQL: SQL 1, SQL 2, SQL 3, and so now there's actually more. So it doesn't matter, we're going to focus on the basics. There are some variations. All right, so you can see the history of the SQL 1 and SQL 2 and SQL 3, and you can do additional research and to see, and there's additional, there's more newer versions. So now let's look at this. We're going to do mostly based on SQL 3. So they are actually SQL 4 and 5. But let's go stick with SQL 3 that's supported by most of database systems. Creating, modifying, and dropping tables. So how you do this? So you're going to do this here is actually use the create table statement. So here's the syntax: create a table and give the name of the table, and then you can list all the attributes and the data type of the attributes. So this is 5 characters course ID. Subject ID is 4 characters, and so the subject ID cannot be not null. And here's course number, it's 4 characters, and this is title. It's up to 50 characters, but this is variant number of characters, not null. Number of credits, and this is number, and here is a constraint. You're going to check num of credits. So this is to check number of credits must be greater than or equal to 1. So this is a constraint. It's also kind of trigger. So if you insert or modify and this tuples and the number of credits is not greater than or equal to 1, then and there's a constraint to be a rest. So here, this is going to be an error message will be rest. So here's constraint. This pk cost is this is the this is name of the constraint, pk cost primary key, and that's the primary key is course ID, and the subject ID is a foreign key and reference and the subject table. SQL is not case sensitive except string literals enclosed in the single quotation marks when you use it. But for consistency, I'm going to have all this, the syntax, the keywords, kind of keywords, and using this, the lowercase. All right, so all the statements here for creating student information system, we introduced the system in the preceding chapter. You can find it in folio, the statements for creating the sample tables in the system. All right, so now there's data types. So you can see this is data types, a number, and this is the, it's a character and the varchar. So all these data types, there are more types. And this table here lists, this is the Oracle data types. But you can also look at MySQL. There's a very similar for MySQL data types. Okay. And most of those data types are also they'll be almost the same as in MySQL. So look at the SQL language is pretty much standardized. So most of the databases are very similar now. All right, so here regarding number types, there are numbers here. So this is the actual data, and this is the data specified. So this is the number, the precision is 6. So, and data type here. So how many, so this is the number is this, the decimal points, and the so there's no decimal points. This is numbers like integer. Here is a 1 after the decimal point, and this is 2 after the decimal point. So this is for the number, and for date, and for the character large block, and so all this. All right, so here's constraints, and constraints are used to define the primary key, foreign keys, and restrictions on attributes. So this is the constraints. You can look at all these constraints here. So there are column level constraints. So look here, it's a column level, it's a primary key. And this is the number of credits is greater than or equal to 1. This is the one column level. And this table level is the foreign key. So when you get this foreign key, like here, it's this is subject ID, references and subject ID in the subject table. So this foreign key, subject ID, and here references the subject ID in the subject table. So this is the foreign key right here. Attribute constraints. So this is the, again, this is the attribute you extend not null. So this is the constraint. Okay, subject ID is not null. So this is here. And so here we have this is constraint, it says title. And so you give this is the title is unique. It's a unique title. So this is not null. Subject ID, the name of the constraint. And so here's constraint. You can put this constraint together. So it's a unique subject ID and a course number. So this is title constraint. It's the unique title, and this is unique subject ID and course number. All right, so let's look at some default values. You can specify a default value in attribute. The default value is used when a null value is inserted. So here, the foreign clause specify the default value for num of credits is 3. So this, you can have default value when you declare this attribute, and this is the number, and this is 1, and default is 3. The in this writing, I use the data types from Oracle database. For the MySQL database, you can just do an online search and to search for MySQL database data types, and you can get all the data types listed online. All right, so here, displaying table information, you can use now a simple select statement. So database, you have data start, and now you want to see the contents of the table, but you can also get the definition of the table. So here, you're going to select here the table name from user table, and this is we do in the Oracle database. Now, in the in MySQL, you can use the describe. So this describe actually also works for Oracle, but it's also works for the MySQL database. I'm going to see that this here is so this for the MySQL database and also Oracle database. You can do the same thing. Describe course, and this is the definition of the course, all the attributes and the data types here listed. And you can get the constraints listed. So all these constraints listed. All right, so let's look at this dropping, renaming, and truncating tables. If a table is no longer needed, it can be dropped permanently using the drop table command. So for example, the following statement drops the cost table, drop table and cost. If a table to be dropped is referenced by other tables, you can use the cascade constraints clause in the drop table command to force the table to be dropped. So this to force the table to be dropped. So just be careful when you use this and you're not sure it's something that's you're going to break the reference in the table. So you can remove all rows and in the table using the truncate table statement. So this is the truncate table and course right here. Altering table definition. Occasionally, you need to alter table definitions to accommodate changes in the database. You can add or drop a column, add or drop a constraint, enable or disable a constraint, and increase the size of an attribute. So this is the command here to add a new column in the cost table. So alter table cost, you're going to add a new column and with the data type and voucher 2 and 50. Now, again, when you use this in MySQL, look at the data type. So you can just use voucher and instead of voucher 2. So voucher 2 is very specific in the Oracle database. You can drop a column provided it's not the only column in the table. So here, alter table and the cost, and you can drop the column new titles. This is the new title and it was created. Now you're going to drop it. So you can add a new constraint. So here, alter table, you can add a constraint. So this is unique key. So this is unique on this subject ID and the cost number. The following command drops an existing constraint. Here you drop table cost and drop this constraint UK. The one you just created, you're going to drop it. So this is the following command modifies the data type of number of credits to this number 5. And you see this is the to this modify the data type. You're going to use a new data type for it. So you can order table, modify, and this, and with the new type, and the default value is 3 for number of credits. A constraint can be disabled or enabled. So you can say, I'm going to order this to disable the constraint and to enable the constraint. Please note that if an altering table command affects the constraints in the other tables in the Oracle database, and like MySQL doing the same thing, will generate an error and no change is done. To force the change and use cascade constraint clause. So here's cascade constraints. So please note that if two tables, T1 and T2, reference each other in the foreign keys, you can just simply first create these two tables without specifying foreign keys, and later add the foreign key constraints using the auto table command. All right, I'm going to stop here and prepare for the next video. All right, see you.